Um, there we go. Welcome everyone to our July Data Stewardship Trends to Watch. As I said, I'm very much impressed with all of you joining in July. I had expected that it would be a very small cohort, but delighted to see many of you joining, and also delighted, as always, to reflect on what are we seeing in the ecosystem that might be of relevant for data stewardship. And so what I will do is I will go through a few kind of developments that I have selected for today. Also share some usual propaganda that might be of interest. And then, of course, we will close and have you all reflect on whether any of that resonates in the environment that you are working in, or whether there are other trends from your part of the world that might be useful to share with this community, which, as you can see from the chat, is a global community. And so again, thanks for joining. So let me start with a few overall trends. And so one of the initiatives that we have developed is kind of an initiative to try to anticipate what are some of the trends that might be important for data policy. And so the last few months, we actually held two studios with about anyway 30 people that we've invited, and we are planning to do more of those studios in the future. And so if you're interested, we can always invite you to those as well. But the idea was to think about how can we as a community become better in actually anticipating trends so that we can also then align data policy in a much better way. Because there's a lot of talk about anticipatory governance, but a lot of that anticipatory governance quite often doesn't happen in the data space. And so what we did was kind of, as I said, we held two studios, which were studios that included a global selected group to really identify what are some of the trends that we are seeing that could be important for data policy. And we published this. If you're interested, we did first a short blog, and then hopefully today or tomorrow, the longer version, but I can share it with all of you as well. The longer version will be made available on Arxiv as well. But it suffices to say is that we basically identified kind of 7 signals, because this was meant to be kind of what are some of the signals that you're seeing that are important for data policy, data governance. Again, I'm not going to go into all signals, otherwise the whole data trends discussion today would be taken up by those signals. But I just will anyway feature a few ones. The first one that I will feature is number 2 here, was that we had a lot of people from statistical agencies that were part of our studios, head of statistics. And from their point of view, one of the biggest trends and one of the biggest signal that they see is that their audience that is knocking on the door of statistical agencies are not humans anymore, right? And so we see this massive shift in actually consumption of data that is made available, whether it's through open data platforms or whether it's made available through the statistical agencies. 90%, if not more, of the visits to those sites are now machines. And so this is kind of a real shift, right, in thinking about how do you make data available, but also a real shift in who is actually consuming the data and what's the risk profile of how that data is subsequently being used, whether it's for training or whether it's for agentic AI kind of purposes as well, right? And so this is kind of a big shift, which also from a data governance perspective, right? Because most of data governance assumes that there is a human processing the data, right, that has a certain code of conduct, or at least has, anyway, is constrained by data governance principles. But that is rapidly changing, right? And as I said, statistical agencies are reporting to us that kind of 90%, if not more, of the visitors that they see to their websites are now all machines, right? And so that is kind of rapidly changing. And so we also need to start thinking about how do you anticipate that from a data policy perspective as well. The other signal here was, of course, the whole discussion about tech sovereignty, right? And so data sovereignty. And so this is basically an indication that this is actually being used to close down a lot of the data, quite often to prevent vulnerabilities to the data infrastructure, but it's also being used quite often to actually not implement open data policies, right? And so we see this tension, right, emerging between being sovereign versus being open, right? And this is again what we already discussed, kind of the data winter, right? An example of the data winter, which is kind of playing out. And I think it's going to be very important to make sure that, anyway, clearly there are public interest objectives behind sovereignty, and clearly there is a legitimate concern about systemic vulnerabilities as a result of kind of having access to data. But it also, anyway, is a concern that we might go into the opposite direction of openness as a result, and that actually that might also undermine the creation of value within a particular country as it relates to data as well. And so that's kind of a third signal that I just wanted to feature here that is kind of interesting that anyway, there's a lot of focus on data sovereignty, but it might actually conflict with other objectives that you might want to have as it relates to making data accessible for public interest purposes as well. And then the third one that I want to emphasize here is the one about shared benefits, right? And again, that's again connected with also the data sovereignty discussion. But that was definitely a signal that we heard from the participants from the Global South that they feel like, anyway, a lot of the data is being extracted and there are no shared benefits that are currently being generated. And so part of the data policy and part of actually developing data strategies is going to have to take into account more and more what is the shared benefit of actually using data and how and who determines what that benefit is. And that's something I will come back to because we do a lot of work these days with indigenous communities who especially have this kind of concern about extractive behavior and the fact that there is no shared benefits, but also with other communities that we see worldwide that there is this concern about, anyway, our data is being used, but what is it that we are benefiting from, right? And this is also, by the way, a concern in knowledge commons like Wikipedia or other knowledge commons who basically are starting to wonder, anyway, we do all this work, but what's the benefit that we see down the line that actually helps us sustain our work? And that's kind of a big trend that we see as well. So anyway, so these are kind of 7 trends. As I said, we will happy to share the longer version, but the blog is already available, and we will do this because one of the signals that we heard from doing those studios is that there is actually no place at the moment in the data governance space quite often to do this kind of anticipatory work, right? What is on the horizon that we should anticipate from a data policy perspective that then subsequently we can already start developing strategies for. And I think there's a lot more work to be done in that space as well. Now, the key message actually from all of that, right, was that we are entering a clear changing data ecosystem, right? So this is not new to all of you, but it is worthwhile reflecting on, anyway, kind of what are some of the trends that we see that are kind of exemplary of the data ecosystems. And one of the other context in which all of this happens is, of course, a broader context of AI. And what is really interesting, and also in some cases troubling perhaps, that we see happening with AI is that slowly but steady AI is becoming toxic worldwide, right? And so we see, anyway, kind of these are the headline, the covers of just two media outlets, like if you, anyway, for those who read Le Monde Diplomatique, on the cover, basically it says that the world is starting to detest AI, right? And if you look at The Economist, which is kind of the other political spectrum of Le Monde Diplomatique, just to show that this is kind of not one ideology, basically, we also see that The Economist is basically reflecting on how AI is actually having a backlash, right? And so that's very important to take stock. And of course, a lot of the backlash quite often is related with this notion of data centers, right? So it's not just the use of data, but it's kind of building data centers worldwide, right, in order to be able to process this. And I've also done some work on that context in the context of having a social license. But it is worth to take stock of that because while, like for instance, in Geneva, you have all those dialogues about AI, and you have a lot of dialogues about AI governance. What actually policymakers are going to have to start really becoming sensitive about is this massive public backlash that we are seeing against AI, right? And I think that's something that also will have an impact on data. Again, I do have to say is the backlash differs somewhat between the global south and the global north, right? I mean, it's kind of in the global north, it's all about against data centers for sure, especially also here in the US, right? Where there is at least, anyway, one bipartisan topic is being against data centers these days. But you also see this now growing worldwide where AI is kind of getting this kind of backlash, at least something to take into account. Now, this backlash also happens more and more at the level of data providers, right? And so what you see, for instance, is that data providers like media, right, which typically now, anyway, we're relying on Google to actually also have audiences visiting their websites. They now also are thinking about, anyway, stopping that relationship, mainly because Google now, of course, if you go to search engines, instead of links, you get an AI summary, right? And the AI summary, surprise, surprise, has no attribution, right, on where they got the content from. And so this is kind of a backlash that we see where media, right, who provides content to the search engines to make those AI summaries, right, are now anyway in kind of this shared benefit concerns kind of element is that, okay, you use our content to create those AI summaries, but we don't have people visiting our websites anymore because they already have the content that you have summarized as such. And so this is kind of a clear concern that we see, which is of course linked with attribution, right? And so, because a key element of data stewardship, right, is always about attributing where you got the data from, so that at least there is this kind of understanding, both in terms of lineage and provenance, but also for certain data holders, very important to also then, of course, have certain revenue attached to this kind of attribution as well. And so this is kind of a study that was done by Elon Strauss. It was also published in Data and Policy, by the way, and by Tim O'Reilly, which basically indicated that kind of for all the data sources, about 30% never gets attributed, right? My hunch is that it's much more, right? Where you actually don't have the attribution on where the data comes from. And we will see this is kind of changing a little bit, but attribution becomes a key crisis as well. Now, the other crisis, of course, is that it's not just the fact that high quality data is now anyway kind of starved from revenue because no one visits their websites anymore. So they don't have any revenue from kind of subscribers. We also see the opposite happening, of course, is where anyway a lot of the data that is now being generated on the internet is now kind of AI generated, right? And so this is kind of a study that basically looks at how the internet is filling up with AI, and they actually predict that some of it might be 100%, right, by 2030, right? 100% might actually be becoming slowly AI generated content. And if you look at kind of the sources, on number one that they reviewed is kind of LinkedIn, right? I think at the moment, I can't read it right now here, but again, yeah, 40% of the content on LinkedIn is already AI generated, right? And if this goes, anyway, as you can see, the pattern there, if this keeps going, right, by 2030, it's going to be 100% of LinkedIn is going to be AI generated, right? And so that, of course, anyway, raises massive concerns in terms of what's the reliability. mean, my concern is also is that anyway, LinkedIn was kind of the social media platform that was kind of somewhat somewhat in line with what we hoped a social media platform looked like. My concern is this is actually rapidly changing as well, right? And so actually the whole social media ecosystem with LinkedIn also already becomes kind of this toxic AI-driven content basket that might also have a short-lived kind of environment as well. But even other parts like Medium, anyway, also 30% of Medium articles are already AI generated, which is, of course, a massive concern with regard to high quality data, but also, of course, the whole public sphere of the information ecosystem that we are consuming is becoming kind of AI generated as well. All right. Now, what we then see on the other hand, because as you might recall from previous discussions, of course, anyway, media is stopping to provide access to data. We also have now on the internet, right? We have now Cloudflare, for instance, robotext, right? Where the public internet is also becoming closed, right? This is kind of the enclosure as a result of the concerns about extraction and having no shared benefits. But what we see happening is then instead of anyway trying to make deals with and be less extractive, AI companies now are kind of buying up all secondhand bookstores, which is kind of an interesting. If you have a secondhand bookstore, now is your moment to get rid of your stock because there are anyway AI companies are buying up all those books and then scan them because they're running out of data, right? For training purposes as well. And this is kind of another thing that is happening, which is kind of anyway worrying on the one hand, where anyway they kind of anyway as you can see, AI companies are constantly anyway pushing the boundaries of having access to data, and the more walls go up, the more creative they become, if you can call it creative, in terms of trying to get data, and they now even go to kind of the analog ones. Exactly, and they also kind of get rid of those kind of analog copies as well. So that's another thing that is happening. And in the meantime, of course, there are other trends, right? And again, we need to be realistic. We're not only living in a world where AI companies are extracting, we're also living in a world where geopolitics is becoming even more concerning. And so that also has an implication on access to data, such as satellite data, right? And anyway, I was at the conference recently on satellite data, and again, there's a lot of concern about kind of satellite data now being closed down by having kind of anyway big states forcing satellite companies to close down their feed because of like conflict, but also for other reasons that we are seeing as well. And this has, of course, implications again on the public sphere, on how journalists cover conflicts, but also, and this is the most worrying part, on humanitarian organizations, right? Because humanitarian organizations are depending quite often more and more on satellite feeds to know where people go, where, anyway, just look at what happened in Venezuela, right? On kind of earthquakes in order to do damage assessment. And if those satellite feeds are now being forced to stop because of kind of relationships they have with procurement relationships they have with big states, that becomes a concern as well. And of course, we see this also happening where other data suddenly disappears during heat waves because it might undermine certain kind of political narratives as well. So all of this, again, indicates indicates that we are really entering this kind of data winter. But of course, we're not dealing with Gen AI anymore. We're now also dealing with agentic AI. And I can assure you this item here is the talk of the day in many places that I also attend, focusing on AI safety, right? And this has been kind of a a total reset of thinking, right? Basically, what happened, some of you might have followed that. OpenAI had a agentic AI that went rogue. Basically, it left kind of a sandbox approach, and then it started attacking, right, without oversight and without knowing. It started attacking Hugging Face, and so this is kind of the latest report of Hugging Face on actually what happened. And so basically, this rogue agent had 17,000 attack in real time on Hugging Face and on their infrastructure. And that was just one agentic AI that went loose. And so everyone is now, of course, up in arms. Imagine that like multiple agentic AIs are suddenly starting to act rogue, then that might kind of undermine the whole infrastructure of the current AI ecosystem. And that is becoming kind of a big concern, let's put it that way, as it relates to how agentic AI is actually creating new risk profiles within both the internet, but also within, of course, the AI ecosystem as well. Now, that's kind of the bad kind of picture. Now, a lot of course, anyway, is happening as well, right? And so we need to also take stock of kind of what is already happening in order to deal with some of those trends. One thing is happening is that there's a lot of efforts now to start looking into kind of, well, how can you start creating shared benefits, right? So this is an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review that comes up with kind of a new model to based upon kind of shared fair parts of the value generated by AI, giving back to the data holders, right? Similar to kind of how Hollywood is rewarding its is or isn't rewarding its contributors, for instance. And so there's a lot more happening in the space of kind of how can you actually price data and then data that's being used by AI that then subsequently can create for shared benefits. There's a lot of work happening in the attribution space. This is an article that was published by Creative Commons, who, of course, as you might remember, Creative Commons has developed this CC signal, right? And CC signal is all about signaling how content creators want to have their data being used, including signaling how they want to have it being attributed, right? Because as you know, one of the biggest CC licenses is all about attribution, right? It's like, how do you want to be attributed for the data that you are publicly sharing? Now, of course, as I told you, the attribution is really in crisis because the CC licenses are quite often not even acknowledged. But anyway, this article also, if you're interested, points to many developments in the space where attribution is being reinstated, right? And actually, anyway, for those who use Claude, Claude, I would say, is one of the kind of models, frontier models that has done the most work in attribution, right? So now, anyway, use Claude, there is quite often attribution already embedded. But there are other initiatives like Open Mind, which is a very interesting initiative if you're not aware of it, that does a lot of work on kind of attribution-based control, right? So where you actually can embed in your data some controls with regard to how your data is being attributed as well, especially as, again, remember how I started this, especially now that actually a lot of the data is being consumed by machines. And so basically this is kind of a way to make sure that machines attribute where they got the data from, right? But we will see it's not as easy as one would imagine. Now, what is also happening is kind of Microsoft research. I might have shared this already with you. They have this big initiative called Project Provenance, because provenance from a data governance perspective becomes key now, right? And lineage and provenance is becoming more and more important. And so they basically are trying to come up with new ways to be able to parse what is AI generated and what is not AI generated, right? So if the internet becomes, anyway, AI generated, it's important to know what is actually AI generated and what was not AI generated. And this Project Provenance is focusing on how this could be done. Again, not straightforward, but at least there is a lot of efforts there. And to deal with all those ROC agentic AI or the ROC agents, what is happening is kind of interesting is that now there's a lot of effort to start thinking about how can we create an identity system for agents, right? So that anyway, if an agent goes ROC, there is a way to identify, right, whose agent it is and where it came from, and also whether it actually has the permissions to access certain data or access certain infrastructures than what it claims to have. And this is a new focus group that was set up by the ITU. I think the first meeting is in December. But there are other initiatives happening as well. And it's interesting because a lot of this actually, anyway, I've written about this. I have not published about it yet, but there's a lot that could be leveraged from kind of the domain name space, right? Which is ultimately an identity-based space, right? But actually, we can also learn from spectrum management, right? That's why ITU is focusing on this, right? Because spectrum management is also about preventing collision or interference. And this is all about preventing collision of agents, right? And so there's a lot of interesting things happening in that space as well. Now, other efforts is of course setting up new ways to control data. And so this is an article that was published last week by Rest of the World. And it basically features what Mozilla is doing, right? So Mozilla is developing those data collectives, as they call it, which is basically controlled environments with regard to how you can control your data that could be used for AI purposes. And so check it out. But of course, the other big focus is on data commons, something that we have worked on as well, which I will share in a second. But this is kind of a feasibility study done by Open Futures for Europeana, which is basically kind of a group in Europe of librarians and cultural heritage organizations. And so they've been looking into creating a data commons so that basically you don't, anyway, that companies don't have to buy up, anyway, old bookstores, but that actually they have access to anyway books, but then in a fair way, right? And again, whether that then can be enforced and whether they still might go and buy all the secondhand bookstores because it's anyway it's in their control. It remains to be seen, right? And this is then where I think regulation needs to be considered as well from my perspective, and legislation on how you can actually enforce data commons as well. And this is, of course, the work that we've been doing. So we released this kind of frequently asked questions document about what do we mean by data commons and what are some of the challenges. And of course, we've launched we've launched this kind of new commons incubator for indigenous languages and cultures, because indigenous communities, of course, are kind of anyway, talking about communities that are kind of between two hard places. On the one hand, they don't want to become more marginalized by not being part of the AI ecosystem, right? And much of their language is not part of the training set, so they cannot even use AI, right? But on the other hand, they don't want to be extracted as well, right? And so it's about how do you prevent marginalization and how do you prevent extraction at the same time? And so data commons is a way to kind of incubate new governance frameworks, but also new kind of access frameworks to language and culture in ways that prevents this marginalization and extraction as well. And so we will incubate about five data commons. And so the application is open. So if you know indigenous communities that would be interested in that, it's a global call. And so let us know. And we are working on more kind of resources towards that end as well. And then, of course, there are other that are still focusing on data intermediaries. So interesting here in the UK, they have this kind of open consultation about how, anyway, data intermediaries could actually start empowering people. And again, it's an interesting consultation that you may be interested in also learning more about what they are doing, and also some of the some of the responses that have been received as well. Now, the big question, of course, in addition to this massive changing data ecosystem and kind of the new um, initiatives that are emerging to deal with some of the concerns of extraction, some of the concerns of new vulnerabilities. Um, of course, the big question is, of course, also, well, how do you make sure from a data stewardship perspective that your data is also AI ready? And so there are, anyway, a few kind of articles that constantly appear. One that I recently reviewed is the one in a blog that I published yesterday, is the one from McKinsey, who basically kind of looked and reviewed many corporations, because from my perspective, there's a lot to be learned also from what happens in kind of corporate sector as it relates to making data AI ready. And so the article that I published yesterday was really thinking about what are some of the lessons learned in the corporate sector that it could be for open data stewards that could be of relevance. And I think there are a few elements that I want to emphasize here. One, what this article indicated was that typically when we think about kind of governance of data or kind of lineage of data, we actually think about the data set as such. But what is changing, right, is that actually the data sets gets parsed into different chunks, right? And now we need to start thinking about data governance of the chunks of data, right? Because the chunks will actually be used in different ways by AI as well. And I think that was kind of an interesting aspect of that article where they actually look into actually it becomes more stewarding not just the data, but actually becomes stewarding fragments of data that could be used in different ways, and that subsequently AI is kind of commingling back together, but could have different lineage and different provenance to a large extent. I thought that was kind of an interesting element with regard to what is changing in stewardship as well. And then, of course, other elements is kind of, anyway, taking a broader perspective on data stewardship. But anyway, there was a lot more in that. And again, feel free to read and see what are some of the lessons learned there as well. But I think one key lesson, which I already have indicated before, is that, of course, the risk profile is rapidly changing of data, right? And so this is another article that basically looks at what is changing in terms of risk profile. And clearly, it quite often is dependent on how you can document provenance, how you can document lineage, how you can also document, of course, quality. And that, of course, given the fact that now you have all those agents using the data, it becomes much harder to kind of develop oversight and accountability and decision rights as it relates to data as well. And so that's kind of important to take into account. And this is just one example of how the risk profile is changing, where, anyway, Pokemon Go data was kind of used. And it turns out actually a lot of US soldiers are using Pokemon Go, which means that AI can now actually identify where US soldiers are based and could be, anyway, create all kinds of vulnerabilities as well. And so you need to start thinking about how AI can actually unlock patterns that you were not anticipating because that data now is also being leveraged by Pokemon Go, for instance, as well. Now, as we all know, a lot of the focus in data stewardship that we, anyway, in our courses is on non-traditional data, which is still very much, anyway, important. And so what we did here, because we still hear all the time, well, what do you mean by non-traditional data? And also, what is actually the value of non-traditional data? So what we released was actually a report here where we showed 100 use cases of non-traditional data, right? So if you're interested in what non-traditional data can do, this might be kind of a place that could be of interest to focus on. And across that, we also look into what are some of the trends. And I think, anyway, some of the biggest trends, of course, is that certain data has real use cases, right? So that, anyway, like, anyway, satellite data has, anyway, is really fit for kind of disaster response use cases. And so we do this kind of analysis of what data has relevant for what kind of use cases, but also that many of those use cases that we see are never just non-traditional data, right? So it's always non-traditional data plus traditional data, and that's kind of another big insight that might be relevant as well. Other For some that are interested in using mobile phone data, another interesting toolkit that was released by the UN Big Data Consortium is this one here, which is kind of design and implementation of mobile phone data initiatives. It's part of what the World Bank has been doing together with organizations like Flowminder. And then basically what is very interesting about this one is that it actually introduces the workflows of how to start using cell phone data, right? And for particular kind of purposes. So if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend the manual. And of course, anyway, one of the articles I also published was on how non-traditional data, as in the US, as a lot of data disappears, how can non-traditional data be kind of a way to deal with kind of the data winter that we are currently seeing as well. So with that, let me end with a few propaganda. Some of you might know is that I'm also kind of the co-founder of the Digital Statecraft Academy, which is an initiative with Cambridge University and with Data for Policy. And so if you're interested to become a fellow, we typically select 20 fellows. Um, we had a meeting already in Cambridge of the current fellows, but we have new applications that are open. So if you're interested, applications are open. And also, anyway, if you're interested in what we mean by digital statecraft, we just published a working paper at ArXiv as well. What are some of the foundations of statecraft in a digital environment, which is all about using digital for governing, but also governing AI and digital at the same time. Then, of course, as I said, we are having this data commons incubator. But some of you might know on August 9th, it's the Indigenous Language Day, International Language Day. And so in context of that, we have a webinar on August 6th, if you're interested, where we will talk with several representatives of indigenous communities, whether it's in Latin America, or whether it's in New Zealand or in Africa, on anyway how they see the value of data commons. And we do this together with also UNESCO. And then the last propaganda is that on September 8th and 10th, we will have our conference on data for policy in Barcelona. And so if you're interested, this is kind of the way to register. And so there we will discuss a lot of the things that were discussed during today's trends as well. And so anyway, with that, feel free to register to that as well. So with that, I'm going to close here our official part of the trends.